Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Esri GeoDev Webinar series. About 2 years ago, we started the series as a way to continue engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between Dev Summits. Speaking of which, we have our next Developer Summit coming up in Palm Springs on March 10th through 13th. We have a lot of new topics, advanced features, and additional functionality to share with you over the coming months. So be sure to stay connected with us through our GeoDev Webinar series page on go.esri.com/geodev or any of our social media accounts at Esri GeoDev. We would love to have conversations like these taking place throughout the year so that when we do meet at one of these Dev Summit conferences, it will be as though we never stopped. We hope you get as much or more out of this webinar than you anticipated. Now, we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Python Map Automation and Beyond. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of an attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce one of our presenters, Jeff Barrett. Let's get started, shall we?
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate everyone for attending today. We look forward to presenting to you the topic of Python map automation. My name is Jeff Barrett, and I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS team for Pro. I'm based out of Olympia, Washington. And also here with me today is Jeff Molds, who is also a product engineer based out of Redlands, California. And together, Jeff and I, we collect requirements and design the API and test and document everything that we're going to be showing you today. In the middle here is Gerhard Trichtel, who does a lot with Python map automation and the sim and presents similar things all throughout Europe. And if you're good friends with him like I am, you'll call him Luigi. So what we want you to do is just sit back and enjoy the donuts that we've provided you, and we'll introduce many of these topics to you. So there's really two components to this presentation today, and I think all of you are going to get something out of this. And we'll first start talking about just the general capabilities of ArcPy.mp, and then we'll move into a more advanced topic. But ArcPy.mp for ArcGIS Pro is a coarse-grained API that allows you to do basic operations, and I emphasize the term coarse-grained. So yeah, there are a limited number of functions and capabilities that allow you to do basic map automation stuff. For example, you may want to update data sources in layer files or in projects. You may want to automate the components of a layout, or get to layers in a map and change extents or export to PDF. ArcPy.mp offers some capabilities that aren't even available inside of the core user interface, and that's, one example of that is to be able to create true multi-page map books. I don't mean just a map series, but map books. So a diagram off to the right here is a graphic that we've actually taken out of our help topic, and it shows you one of the basic structures or an object model diagram of the types of objects you can work with ArcPy mapping. But, like with any object model diagram, you need to start somewhere. And so basically with ArcPy.mp, the starting points are either a layer file or an ArcGIS project. And so with a layer file, it's a container of stuff, right? It's a container of one or many layers, and you may want to iterate through those layers and either change symbology, definition queries, or maybe data sources. And then the ArcGIS project object is a container of a lot of stuff, right? It has a lot more than just layers. It has layouts and maps and map frames and cameras and other capabilities. Ultimately, what you're going to do is either save all the changes that you've performed on the particular objects, or perhaps you may not want to make any or save any changes at all, but just maybe export everything to PDF to get some final product. There are some basic rules of engagement when working with ArcPy.mp, and they're very, very simple to understand. There's just a couple of them. One of the things is understanding the entry points. So, for example, with ArcGIS project, there's two ways of actually working with a project. One way, which we call running a standalone script, requires that you provide a path to an APRX file. Basically, what happens is that APRX gets opened in memory, and you're working with the objects within that in memory. The application does not need to be opened. The other option is you can use ArcGIS project with the current keyword. Now, this is really useful if you're working in the Python window and you're just experimenting with the API and you want to see directly in the application what your commands are doing. Or if you're working with a script tool, script tools are run within the application, so those script tools that are referencing current are going to do everything to the current application. And then working with layer files, well, it's really as simple as referencing them out on disk, and so we can reference LYR or LYRX files. Another important component to understanding the ArcPy MP design is that we have a lot of list functions, and those list functions allow us to get to objects from other objects. So here's an example of where I'm looking at the current ArcGIS project, and perhaps I want to go and I want to get to a map located in that project, because a map can have 0 or many maps. So in this example, we're going to our project reference and we're listing our maps and we're looking for a very specific map that's called map. And because list functions return list objects, but we want the object within that list, we're going to use a zero-based indexer to return the specific object. So if we do the correct wildcard search on the object, it should be the one and only, so we will return that one object. Now, from our maps, now we can navigate to get either bookmarks or tables or layers. And so next we're going to create a layer variable that's going to the map, and it's referencing a layer that has a wildcard search here that includes the text string land. And again, we're going to use our zero-based index to return that layer object. Now, it's way too easy to forget to add the brackets, and sometimes you don't want the brackets. You're just simply going to iterate through the list of layers and do something to them. And I'll show you in the demonstration of what I mean by what it looks like if you forget to actually reference the object that you're interested in. I guarantee it'll happen to you. And again, I just want to iterate the fact that ArcPy.mp, the curated or the managed API that we've exposed, doesn't have access to everything that you can do in the user interface. We've designed it to allow you to automate common capabilities. So for layers, for example, you can change definition queries, layer visibility, save changes out to a LYRX. Or for a map, maybe add layers, clear the selection, set camera options, etc. So what I want to do is navigate this object model diagram in a demonstration. So I'll get into Pro and I'll start typing away. And really, I just want you to understand how easy it is. I'm going to be touching about 8 different objects, and you'll see how quickly I'm actually navigating those using ArcPy.mp. So let me switch to my application and just talk about a couple things. So here I am inside of ArcGIS Pro, and I have a world map and I have a couple of layouts. And over here I have a couple other layouts that are really just, they have pictures embedded in them. So in this case, I took that object model diagram from help and I embedded it in a layout. But what I want to do is I want to start with the ArcGIS project object, and I want to navigate down to the layout. And then I'm going to get to the map frame, and I'll explain more as I go. So as we already saw, I'm going to reference the ArcPy site package. I'm going to go to the mapping module, and I'm going to use the ArcGIS project function, and I'm going to use current so that we can see everything that I do directly in the application. Now, Now that I have the project object reference, you'll see there are a number of members or functions and properties that we expose to you, and you'll see that there are a number of list functions. So we can list reports and list maps. Well, I want to list layouts. Before I forget, I'm going to create a variable called layout, and I'm going to make that equal to list layouts. Now in my project, I have multiple layouts. So I want to make sure that I find one uniquely so that I know that it is the one that I'm interested in. So here's 8.5 by 11 landscape. We also have a portrait. But I'm going to work with the landscape map, and I'm just going to enter in a wildcard string here and maybe do a star scape. And I mean, I could type in the whole string and that's always going to work, right? But I'm just using a wildcard because I know this is going to work, and I'll hit enter. Now when I type LYT dot, we're starting to see members that we would expect to see for a layout. I can export layouts, I can list elements, get to metadata, map series, page information, etc. So now that I'm down here and I'm working with the layout, the next thing I want to do is I want to get to a map frame. And again, we used list elements to get to all these different types of elements. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to create a variable called map frame, and I'm going to type map frame equals layout.list elements, and I want to specify a map frame element. But I also know that I have two different types of map frames. So again, I'm required to use a wildcard to make sure I get the one of interest. So I'm going to do main star. I want the main map frame. And I'll use my bracket. Actually, this time I'm not going to use my bracketed 0. I'm going to make that common mistake. I'll hit enter, and I'll type mf dot, and I'm not seeing the members that I would expect to see in a map frame. That's because what I have right now is a list object. I don't want a list object. I want a map frame object. So I'm going to up arrow, add my bracketed zeros, hit enter again, type mf dot, and sure enough, I can get to like the camera. All page layout elements have position and sizing properties. I can export individual map frames if I want. If I don't want the whole layout, but I want just the map, I can do that. I can get to the map. I can get to visibility, and I have panning and zooming capabilities. So what I want to do over here is, now that I have a reference to the map frame, map frames have maps associated with them. And maps also have bookmarks associated with them. So what I'm going to do is navigate from my map frame to my map to my bookmarks so that I can change the extent of my map frame to reference one of those bookmarks. So let's do that. I'm going to create a variable called m for map. I'm just simply going to reference the map. Now I'm going to create a variable called bookmark, and I'm going to make that equal to my map, and I'm going to list my bookmarks. And I know, using a wildcard, that the name of one of the bookmarks is called Lake Huron. And I'll use my zero base index. So now, going all the way through this, I'm going to go back to my map frame. I'm going to call one of the zoom functions. I'm going to call zoom to bookmark and simply pass in my reference to a bookmark and hit enter. And there we go. We've gone in and we've modified the extent of a map frame on a layout in a project. And in the reverse order, that's how we did it, right? So let me just do a couple other things to show you the simplicity of the capabilities of ArcGIS, and then we'll take it to the next level. So what I want to do is I want to modify this name, and I also, or this text element called name, and I also want to update this picture element. So I'm going to create a variable called text. And again, I'm going to go to my already referenced layout, and I'm going to list my elements. And this time I'm going to work with the text element. Now there are lots of text elements here. And so I'm going to grab the one that's called name. And again, I'll reference it. Now, I want to point something out here, and it's going to be a segue into the next portion of our presentation, but I'm going to look at the members that are associated with the text element. Again, through the managed ArcGIS API, we have abilities to clone, delete, again, position and size. But in terms of the text itself, we can really only change the text string, the text angle, or the text size. But think of all the other things that you can do with text, right? You can set halos, you can set to all small caps, there are all these properties that are exposed in the ribbon or in the panes that you don't have access. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to set the text string to equal Lake Huron. And again, because I'm using the current reference, it's immediately going to update in the application. And one last time, I'm just going to update that picture. So I'm going to go to my layout. I'm going to list elements. Again, this time I'm going to work with a picture element. I know it's the one and only picture in the contents, so I don't need to specify a name or a wildcard. It's always good practice to do that, but I'm going to reference it. Now that I have my picture element, you can see that again we have those positional capabilities, visibility of course, but I want to set the source image. Right? This allows me to change the picture with a new picture by just re-referencing another one. So I'm going to come into my pictures folder here, and I'm going to right-click, choose copy as path, and I'm just going to set this equal to R, and then Control V, and there's my path, and I hit enter. So now you can see with a relative few number of commands, I've started to automate or to change this layout. Now, what might I want to do next? Well, maybe I want to go back to the project object and I want to save, right? Maybe I want to save it on top of itself, save the changes directly to the current project, or maybe I want to save those changes out to somewhere else, to another APRX file. Or maybe I want to take my layout and I don't want to save any changes. I just simply wanted to create a PDF. So I can export to PDF or GIF or, the 10 or 11 formats that we make available to you. And each of them have a different set of properties that you can configure. Now, I'm not going to do any exporting right now because I'm going to do that in a follow-up part of my demonstration. So what I'm going to do is go back to the presentation and talk now about ArcGIS MP SIM access. Okay. It's really fancy sounding. SIM stands for Cartographic Information Model. But really simply put, it's just a series of text files, essentially, that are a JSON specification that control how we persist all this information to file. So that when you open up a project or you open up a LayerX, that information is the instruction that controls how all that gets presented in front of you. And we have access to many of those capabilities in a project or its documents. Now, this allows you to get to finer grained capabilities. The ArcGIS MP managed API, as I showed you with text for an example, doesn't have everything that you may need. Maybe you want to change the font name. Well, that wasn't available in the managed API, but it is available through the SIM. We provide access to a limited number of types of documents. So for example, anything that's a layer or a table, a map, or a layout, we can get to the SIM definitions of those objects, which then expose many more additional properties. So here's an example of a very small portion of an LYRX JSON structure, and we're just showing you a small portion of a renderer. So we have a layer, and that layer is a renderer. It has a symbol reference. That symbol reference has a symbol, and this symbol has multiple layers. So it's a solid fill symbol, and it's also a solid stroke. So with ArcGIS.mp, you don't have access to some of these properties like, join style or miter limit. But if you get to that through the SIM, then you will have that access. And if you understand how to read the JSON structure, you'll understand how to navigate that same structure using Python. So similarly, once I have a reference to a layer's SIM definition, and I'll talk about that next, we can go to its renderer, its symbol, reference, its symbol layers. We'll get the second level, which is index 1. We'll get to its color class and change its values. So that's really what we want to show you right now is how these JSON structures work and how you can read them. And then we'll demonstrate so many of the things that you can do. Now, this is also clipped out of our help system. Please, 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 please do not edit these files directly. Yes, you can do it. It can be done. And you'll be tempted to do it. But think of how easily it would be for you to go into this file that you see, this graphic on the right, and you accidentally get rid of a curly bracket, or you accidentally modify some of the tabs. You can wreak havoc on that thing. So let's use the APIs to make the changes, because I promise you, you can even make mistakes with the API. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later. So be careful, don't edit these directly. So what is the basic workflow for working with these sim objects? It's really easy. So we start with an object. And like I said earlier, we can work with maps, layers, tables, and layouts. And that's what we're limited to at this point. And once we reference our, let's say, our map through the standard ArcPy mapping API, then we have a method called getDefinition. And what that does is it returns the sim definition of that object. So that exposes all those additional properties that I showed you in that graphic. So we're going to do something to those properties, and then we're going to push those changes using setDefinition back to the object. Now, the only thing I didn't explain here is when we use getDefinition is we have this required parameter called version. Now, we released this capability at ArcGIS Pro 2.4. And in all 2.x releases, you're always going to be using version 2. But Esri follows the schematic versioning changing rules, and that means that when we come out with a next major release, and let's just call that 3.0, we can break the sim. We can make changes to the sim. They're called breaking changes, and they are allowed at major releases. So that could potentially stop your scripts from running because it's possible we may have changed something that your script used. So by providing the version number, even if you're running your script on a 3.0 release, you can still tell it to use the version 2 sim. Okay, so that's just why that's there. So let's kind of look at this, and I kind of like the title here because Cartographic Information Model thinks it's all about cartography, and that first JSON structure I showed you was about a layers symbology, but it's so much more than just cartography. So let me switch back to my demonstration, and I'm going to clear the transcript, and I'm going to move over to this world map, and I want to open up the attribute table for lakes. And this is a very common request that we've gotten many, many times where people want to be able to use Python to be able to modify the appearance of tables. So in this particular example, we see object ID and shape, and maybe they don't want to see those fields. Or we move over to something like shape length and shape area, and they want to be able to change the aliases so it says perimeter and area. And maybe they don't like the formatting of the data, right? Look at all these decimal places, and maybe they want separators. So we're going to use the sim to do that because you can't do it with arcpy.mp or even core arcpy. So here's a trick. I'm going to take this lakes layer, and I'm going to come down to shearing, and I'm going to shear it as a layer file. So I'm going to call it lakes.lyrx, and I'll simply click Save. And then I'm going to come to File Explorer, and you'll see that I have my lakes.lyrx. And what I'm going to do is I can make a copy of it, or I'm just simply going to rename its extension. And before I do that, I can say that you can right-click on this thing right now and edit it in Notepad. It's just a basic text file. But I like to give it an extension JSON because when I open that in Notepad++, it formats it a little bit nicer in terms of coloring. right? So it's a little bit easier to read. But here you're seeing that JSON structure, and know that there's just a lot of stuff that you have access to. It's incredible. And again, this is everything that describes that layer. If I do a Control F and I do a search on table, just like standalone tables, well, we have a feature table, right? And this feature table has a list of fields, and here is the first field name called object ID, and it has an alias and it has a number format, and they're all different, things that can be modified with it. And then we move down to the second field and then the third field, etc. So here we have a list of field descriptions. And so what I want to do is use ArcPyMP with sim access to make changes to those fields. So let's do that. And rather than typing in front of you now, I'm just simply going to load a few lines of code. And everything up here you've already seen. I'm just referencing the current project, which I've already done, but now I'm referencing a map called world and a layer called lakes. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to go to my layer, and I'm going to return its definition, which then will give me a variable that's referencing the sim representation of that layer. I'm going to hit enter. And I'm also going to come over here, and here's another layout that I've created that again just has a screenshot of that JSON structure that I showed you. And I want to work with this thing. So now that I have my layer object, you can see these are the standard types of properties that we expose to a layer in our managed API, or I can go to the sim and type dot, and you'll see I have a few extra things here, right? And these are all of the items that you're going to see inside of that very, very long JSON representation. So, you want to control selection color or show map tips or show legends. There's a lot of capability here. And if we just look at this diagram from the layer, we have this feature table option. So I can type feature table. And the feature table has field descriptions, and you just look at the indenting and it essentially tells you your dot notation. So I can do field descriptions, right? So what I'm going to do is just clear this out, and I'm going to load another piece of code that does the rest. Let me explain what it does. So what I'm doing is I'm iterating for every field in my sim definition. I'm going to iterate through the feature table and each of its field descriptions. If the field name, right, we have field name down here. Field name is object ID. If it's object ID or shape, then let's set the visibility property. It's currently set to true. We want it set it to false. We don't want to see it in that table. And then for the shape area and shape length, I'm doing essentially the same thing. I'm looking for it by name. I'm changing it from 6 decimals to 2 decimal places. I'm changing the alias, and then I'm padding it with 1,000 separators. And then all I simply do is I take all the changes that I made and I push those back to the object. So I'm going to hit enter. I'm now going to go back to my lakes table. And you'll see that I no longer have object ID, I no longer have shape, and if we move over here, you can see that I've modified perimeter and area, and I've done all that formatting to make it a little nicer looking. So again, if you can understand the JSON structure and start to understand the indentation, etc., you can start to mimic that inside of, in this case, the Python window or in your standalone IDE. So now I'm going to show you a little bit more. I'm going to switch over to another project, and here I have a map that's called earthquakes and a layout that's called earthquakes. And when I added the earthquake data and I time enabled it, these are just the default settings, right? So I can do the time slider and I can just navigate this. What I want to do over here is I want this this layout I want to create a temporal map series where I start at 1975 and I create 5-year windows all the way to 2010. So currently in the ArcPy.mp API, we don't have time capabilities exposed yet, but you can get to that information through the sim. So let me open up a script that I already have, and this is an example of a standalone script. So yes, the project is open right now. It doesn't have to be, but I'm going to be referencing that project by name out on disk. So I'm actually opening it in memory, independent of the project that's currently open. I'm going to go out, I'm going to look for my earthquakes layout, and this is where I'm going to set up my time, right? So I'm starting at 1975, I'm going all the way to 2010, and I'm going to do it in 5-year windows. So something else I want to show you is if I come over here and I already took that layout and I exported it out to a PageX and I renamed that PageX to JSON, and it's a huge file because it's got lots of stuff in it. But really what I ultimately want to get to is time display right here, gets time value, and set the start and the end time. Now these start and end times are in epoch values, so they're really not human readable, but I will set them using human readable time functions. So again, navigating this display, if I come up a little bit, I'll see that all of this happens in a view, and this view happens inside of the map frame. So if we go back to the script, we are getting the definition of our layout. Now understand that I'm actually going to do this 5 or 6 times. For each page that I'm exporting, I'm going to set all of its current time settings, export to PDF, and then do it all over again. So I'm navigating, I'm finding a map frame in my layout of elements. And then once I have my map frame, again, navigating that JSON structure, I go to the view, the time display, the time values, set the start. And here I'm setting using a date time function that allows me to set the year, the month, and the day. And then this is my 5-year window. So I do that. And then to my layout, I've modified its sim, and I'm going to set that back to the layout. And then I'm going to export it out to PDF. And you're going to see those PDFs automatically open right in front of you. So let's just click Run. Again, this is an example of a standalone script. And it's going to start doing its magic, and we'll see some print statements that'll tell me the page that it's currently printing. And then we're going to actually see those pages open directly in front of us. So any second now, some PDFs will start appearing. And if you pay attention to the dates as it goes from one inserted PDF to the next, they're going to be updating. And you'll see a slight configuration in the distribution of earthquakes. And we have 2 more pages to add. So again, this is something you can't do with ArcPy.mp directly, but you can if you use SimAccess. And again, this was all made available in 2.4. So now I can just navigate the pages and you can see the time series that I've generated. That's kind of fun. That's exciting. So I'm going to close all those tabs. I'll close this, minimize this, and go back to one more fun example that I like to show. This is, these layouts currently are identical to each other. So we have a before and one labeled after, but right now they're identical. And I'm going to use the sim script to do a whole bunch of things. And before I forget, everything and anything that I showed today in terms of the scripts that were executed are available in the help system. So you don't need to get the scripts from us. Don't worry about that. They're all in the help, and we'll talk about those resources just before we address questions. But this is going to do many things. It's going to modify a layer sim. So in this case, yes, it's modifying field descriptions. You've already seen that. But I'm also going to modify layer chart properties. right? And set those changes back to the layer. The majority of the stuff that I'm doing though is modifying a layout sim. So again, I'm referencing a layout and I'm getting its definition and I'm iterating through all of the elements in that layout sim. And I'm testing for names. So hey, if you're called map frame 1, I want to change the extent indicator symbology. I want to change its color and maybe its width, right? And then I'm going to do a bunch of stuff to grid lines, grids and graticules and their labels. Lots of stuff going on here, and you'll see it's easier to explain in the final result. I'm going to modify a dynamic table frame. I'm going to remove unnecessary fields. I'm going to modify the header symbology so it looks nicer. I'm going to introduce some gaps, etc. I'll modify a legend, control horizontal alignment, and do some custom patch changes to individual items. I'll go into text and I'll modify the text to be all small caps. I'll go in and I'll play with its halo symbol. And then I'll even reference paragraph text, change its font type, and also make it 2-column. So I'm going to minimize this, and so that you can see all the changes directly in the application, I'm going to load that script which references current. And everything I showed you, I just loaded into the Python window, and I'm going to execute. So now the layout's going to update with the dozen or so different changes, and you can see that yes, ArcGIS sim axis is not just about cartography, because I am not a cartographer and I'm really good at making ugly stuff. But anyway, you can see I have small caps. I have a really ugly red halo. I've gone into the grids and I've modified not only their symbology for the horizontal versus the vertical, or the symbology for the labels that are east and north versus south and west, I've also changed the interval. I went into the extent indicator and I changed the symbol of that rectangle. I went into the table and I modified its patches and I did some slight formatting. I modified its title, and here's that paragraph text element that at one time was just a basic paragraph, and I split it into multiple columns. Here's the dynamic table where I not only removed fields, but I also formatted the headers. I formatted the text. I formatted the numeric values. I guess the point here is that with access to the sim, we're exposing so many more capabilities to you. So now I want to go back to the presentation and just summarize what sim access really means. So we are providing finer grained access to project properties, but not all project properties. Again, we're limiting you to maps, layers, layouts, and tables. I knew there was another one. And another advantage of providing this access to you is, of course, there's always that one item that we provide, that one item that we don't provide you in the managed API. Maybe you want to be able to change font type, and it's not there, and it's like you really, really need to do it. And so now you can, through the sim. But the other really important component here is that Pro is growing so rapidly. There's so many new capabilities being added with every release, and there's just no way that our small development team can keep up with all those changes and keep Python up to speed with all of that, and particularly ArcPy mapping. So by exposing the sim to you, we are giving you those access to those changes immediately with each release. That doesn't mean we're going to stop managing the curated API. We're going to continue to do stuff. We have every intention of adding time capabilities. It's just we can't keep up with the progress at which Pro is growing. And then this has almost always been available to the .NET community, and I don't see any reason why Python developers can't have that same access. Now, yes, it seems awesome. You're excited. You're going to be able to do everything you think, okay? It's not the easy button. It's not magic. There are things that you can't do with the sim. And I want to take a little bit of time and explain that to you. This is also defined in the documentation that we've laid out. So it does not provide access to everything. So, I mentioned maps, layers, tables, and layouts. There are higher level project properties, like think of all of that backstage stuff that you can do via the options tab for a project. Many of those things you don't have access via the sim. We hope to get them to you, but right now you don't. Currently, we don't have access to metadata. And there are some things that you think you may have access to, but you really don't. And a great example of that is spatial reference. You may have noticed it in one of the JSON structures that I showed you, but spatial reference is a real tricky thing. And you think, oh, there's a property called spatial reference, and I'm going to go and easily change its WIC ID. Don't do it. It's not going to work. And the reason I say that is that spatial reference is such an important component, and it's built in throughout the map and all of its layers in that map. So you would need to change it in many locations, and you may not know where all those locations are. You may be working with a layer, but you also need to change it over in the map. And you would also need to appropriately update all the geographic transformations because we support projection on the fly. So what Sim Access is really good for is changing simple properties, booleans, text values, numeric values, but you can't use the sim to change a renderer, right? I can't use the sim to change my renderer from simple symbol to graduated colors because the sim, let's say we start with simple symbol, the sim is describing that. How are you going to know what to do to modify it to become graduated color? Okay, so there are some nuances here that make it a little more challenging, and we have some ideas for future releases to kind of make some of this a little bit easier for you. That's either through capabilities in the managed API or capabilities that we add to Sim Access. Another important component is that you cannot create new objects. And that has always been how ArcPy mapping and ArcMap worked and how ArcPy MP works in Pro. The idea of Python map automation was to be able to automate objects that already existed or already exist. And so you could produce many objects, many scale bars, for example, and control their visibility or bring them on and off the page based on scale thresholds or whatever. But we never allowed you to create a scale bar object because think of all of those properties and capabilities, and we just don't want to build a Python API that's that advanced. But the sim allows us to do that. So we hope to soon allow you the ability to create new objects, but currently we can't. And then finally, I hinted to this earlier, there's no lifeguard on duty. Okay, so when you're in the user interface, you're using ArcGIS Pro, and you may toggle a setting, and you'll notice that when you pick that setting, other settings are disabled, right? Because they're mutually exclusive. You can't do both at the same time. But if we give you access to the sim, and you try and change both things at the same time, what's the expected result, right? Managed APIs, the user interface blocks you from making those mistakes. And every once in a while, right, even in the user interface, you do something and the application doesn't behave appropriately. Well, imagine what you could do if there was no lifeguard, right? So be careful. And I'm not trying to scare you away. I'm asking you to be cautious. Read the documentation and experiment. Make copies of your projects or your layer files. Play with them, experiment with them, test it, and then implement it. So lastly, I just want to move over to the questions section where Jeff and Luigi will helping you, and I may participate as well. But I just want you to be able to look at some of the resources that we've made available. So what you see here is an Esri URL .com and then and then enter any one of those numbers, and it'll bring you directly to these help pages. So we have Introduction to ArcPyMP, we have a tutorial, we have migrating from ArcMap to Pro. You know, a lot of Python scripts just worked when you move from ArcMap to Pro, but not the ArcPy mapping scripts, because Pro is just a completely different application. You know, in Pro, we can have 0 layouts. In ArcMap, you always had one layout and only one layout. We work with 3D in Pro, and so anyway, there's lots of differences in how we navigate the application, and therefore ArcPy mapping scripts aren't simply going to run in Pro, but it's really not that hard to migrate those scripts. It's, you know, it's just a new vocabulary that you need to modify. We have updating and fixing data sources, web map printing, and of course, second to last there is Python sim access. And so that's really the fun thing that we're looking forward to talking about today, because you know it's as simple as the managed API. It's just you need to understand how to navigate those JSON specifications. And then lastly, we have an ArcGIS online site that we push sample scripts and tools. So anyway, with that, I really want to thank you for attending today. I hope you enjoyed all those donuts. I'm going to hand you back to Jim, and then Jim's going to work with Luigi and Jeff to get your questions answered. So thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jeff. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate it. We are now going to begin answering the questions that have been submitted during today's webinar. We've received quite a few. Thank you very much. And we will try to get through as many as possible. But whatever we do not get to today, we will address in a GeoNet blog post after this webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel, and we'll try to get to it. So, guys, our first question is that, let me see, as we transition to ArcGIS Pro, are there any tools to help us get from ArcPy mapping to ArcPy.mp without having to rewrite all of our scripts that use ArcPy mapping?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So the on Jeff's last screen, actually that's up right now, there's a help topic there called migrating from ArcMap to Pro. And basically you need to read that topic, and the what Esri tries to do with Python is that we always try and make our scripts from previous versions work in new versions. And if your script is just doing like regular ArcPy stuff like GP tools, a lot of that stuff is just going to work in Pro. Those ArcMap scripts will work in Pro most of the time. There is a utility that is linked in that topic that will convert ArcMap scripts to Pro scripts to handle the differences in Python 2 to Python 3. But ArcPy.mp is doesn't fall into that category. That's because, and Jeff talked about this, there's a lot of differences between ArcMap and Pro. You know, one of the big ones being that in ArcMap, a lot of your scripts start with referencing an MXD, and in Pro, your scripts start with referencing a project. So there's a lot of differences like that. However, the logic between the ArcMap scripts and the Pro scripts for ArcPy.mp is actually very similar. So you just have to do a little bit of work to convert those manually. So that's the answer to that.
Great. Okay, thanks. Next question is, what is an LYRX file type?
Oh, okay. An LYRX file type, that's a layer file in ArcGIS Pro. So that's analogous to an LYR file in ArcMap. So it's just the new style of layer files that are used in Pro. And that's relevant to ArcPy.mp because Jeff was mentioning these different entry points in ArcPy-MP, where you can either start with an ArcGIS Pro project, or you could start with the layer file. And in ArcPy.mp, you could access the layer file and start doing stuff with that layer file. For example, changing data sources and symbology and what have you.
All right. Next is, when will the sorry guys. Will the sim be documented a bit more in the documentation at some point?
I'll take that one. So if you actually go to the Python Sim Access help topic 15.895, we obviously give our concept topic kind of describes everything relative to ArcPy.mp. But there is a link there that brings you to the repo for our sim repo. And there is a much more thorough description and documentation of those items. And that is about as extensive as we get. Now, if you're interested in understanding, definitions of each individual little property, those may not be there, and maybe that's what you're asking for. And what I like to do is I'll go into the .NET SDK help, because a lot of that stuff is documented there. So yes, you may not be working with .NET, you may not even have Visual Studio, but just as an idea, you can go into the reference help in .NET and look at a lot of those sim classes, and it is populated at that location. So either at the repo or in the .NET help or our Python Sim Access help topic. That's the best that we have right now.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Next question. I think you covered this, but we'll hit it one more time. Is the information in this webinar applicable to ArcMap or to ArcGIS Online, or pretty much just to ArcGIS Pro?
Hi, Gerhard. This information we provide is applicable for ArcGIS Pro only, because only ArcGIS Pro has the ArcPy-MP model and gives you access to the sim specification, as Jeff mentioned in his presentation. ArcMap will not support this, even not in the future. Only ArcGIS Pro support this.
Okay, thanks, Luigi. Next question. For the map series example that you showed, is it possible to export all of the layouts into one joint PDF, or is it only possible to export them individually into their own PDFs?
Thanks, Jim. That's a good question. When you export a layout, you have the option to either export to a single PDF file, or you could export each page into individual PDFs. What?
Okay.
I'm just going to add to that. In my particular example, I exported them all into individual PDFs because I wasn't exporting a map series, so I don't have that option. So I had to export to the individual PDFs, but we also have in our managed API PDF document management tools where I can create a brand new PDF and then append all of those individual pages into that PDF. And now I have a multi-page PDF and I can remove those individual pages. So if you were to actually go to any of our exports to PDF samples, we'll show you how to do that in our standard help. We have samples that address that, because some people want to be able to create a map series of different formats, and that's just one of the tricks of doing that.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Next question. How are these scripts linked to templates? For example, how do we make sure a script is run every time a project is opened or a new project is created?
The question is focusing more on the scripts provided by Jeff. Those are linked to his map. When you make for your maps, just keep it with variables, not with hard-coded string, then you can reuse your script in other projects as well and fit into your needs. The scripts we provided there are linked to a dedicated project and hard-coded, as Jeff showed, with the elements he was searching for the layout, with the name and so on.
Super. All right, thanks, Luigi. Next, do you know when Jupyter Notebooks will be integrated within ArcGIS Pro?
Okay, that's a good question. Jupyter's been shipped with Pro for a few releases now, but it was a standalone notebook, and version 2.5 has the notebooks embedded into Pro, so you could actually open the Jupyter Notebooks in Pro. So that's version 2.5, which is the next release that's coming out soon.
Okay, great. Next, is it possible to change the color of a layer's outline depending on the color of an overlapping layer? In other words, can layer symbology be based on a spatial relationship to features in a different layer?
Okay, I'll try and answer that one, or anybody jump in if you want, but that's a very specific question. I think the answer is yes, and you would do a spatial selection, and then you'd be able to get the symbology of the layer that overlaps the one of the target layer, and then you could use those sim properties and apply them to the target layer. So I believe the answer is yes for that.
Yeah. And I'm just going to add to that a little bit. And, you know, one of the first things I try and do is get to the desired result in the user interface. So I may have my layer. It has a starting point of a sim definition of symbology. Then I'm going to modify that layer however I want it, and that's going to be my endpoint. So what I may do is export both of those layers, the before and the after, out to a JSON structure and look at those definitions. If you can do it in the UI and it's persisted in the sim, which it should be, it is, you should be able to change it with Python Sim Access. And I guess that's just a really important trick, is that sometimes when you look at a sim and you want to change some enumeration value, but you don't know what the other value is, as a developer trying to create some end product, you want to create everything in the UI, export out, look at the JSON structure to see what those values are that you want. That's it.
All right. Okay, so that's about it for time here. Thank you so much, Jeff, and Luigi. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Python Map Automation and Beyond. If you have any other questions, please contact us using the email address in your follow-up email. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We will be publishing a video recording of this presentation, which will be available within 7 to 10 business days on the go.esri.com/geodev page. And as I mentioned before, we do have some additional questions, but we're out of time. So the ones that we did not get to today, we will address those in a GeoNet blog after this webinar. On behalf of Esri and our presenters, we thank you very much for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.